Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to this webinar on how to protect against cyber attacks. So just a few words about myself. So my name is Nadia Mestri. I have been working as a DFIR specialist at Oneconsult for more than 3.5 years. One of my main tasks is to support customers when it comes to analyzing and handling cyber incidents. So what I'm going to present to you today is actually what we see in our day-to-day work. So the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CSIRT, published an advisory in November 22 already on inadequate security controls and practices exploited for initial access. So it indicates that cyber criminals often attack companies and organizations by exploiting these weaknesses in order to infiltrate the systems and steal valuable information or cause damage. So in this webinar, we'll explain the most common initial attack vectors used by attackers and also provide recommendations on how to protect against these cyber attacks. So even though the CISA advisory was issued in 22, it remains entirely relevant today. So this is illustrated by the current threat figures provided by the Swiss National Cybersecurity Center. So you can see here that the most reported attacks last week were fraud, so including fake support, fake extortion, and CEO fraud, as well as phishing, so social engineering attacks, and then comes hacking. So social engineering attacks are thus one of the most prevalent initial access vectors. So we can also see here that phishing is present among the initial access vectors for ransomware. So this graph was created by the CSIRT, so the Computer Emergency and Response Team of New Zealand. And the article and the graph are very well put together and clearly show how attackers find their way into the network before moving all over the place and gaining access to all systems and then having a final impact, which means encrypting systems and demanding a ransom in case of ransomware. So other initial access vectors here are the exploitation of vulnerabilities, the use of valid credentials, as well as internet exposed services. So these were also mentioned in the CSIRT's advisory. So we can also see here that techniques can also be combined. So for example, a phishing email is used to obtain access data, so credentials, that can then be used on the services exposed online, or an email can have a malicious attachment that can be used then to deliver malware directly. So these initial access vectors are also present in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. So MITRE ATT&CK is a globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques. And this matrix is a framework for understanding and categorizing various tactics and techniques that attackers use during cyber attacks. So in this webinar, we will focus on the attack techniques for initial access. Those were mentioned in the CISA advisory, that is, exploit public-facing application, external remote services, phishing, trusted relationship, and valid accounts. What is not mentioned in the CISA's advisory, but which I think is important to highlight, is the use of removable media. So we'll also talk about that near the end of the webinar. So as I've just mentioned, during this webinar, I will focus and go through these 5 key entry vectors. So social engineering, that is phishing emails, etc. Get valid credentials through brute force, password spraying, for example. Open ports and exposed services, vulnerabilities in appliances, services, and software. And we'll finish with removable media like USB sticks. So let's start with social engineering attacks. So social engineering is a form of interpersonal manipulation with the aim of causing people to behave in a certain way and thus to lead them to do something they wouldn't normally do. So for example, divulge confidential information like credentials. It thus exploits human behavior such as curiosity or helpfulness. So there are several forms of social engineering. So the most well-known being phishing, of course. So advisory, they may send phishing emails to gain access to victim system. So all forms of phishing are electronically delivered social engineering, of course. So phishing can be targeted, is then known as spear phishing. So a specific individual, company, or industry will be targeted by the adversary. Or more generally, adversaries can conduct non-targeted phishing, that is then known as spam, for example, to distribute malware via mass malware spam campaigns. So the victims are sent an email that contain a malicious attachment or link, typically to download and execute malicious code on the systems, or for example, to forward them to a lookalike login page to get the credentials. Then we also have CEO fraud. So this is when the attacker sends an email from the boss or the CEO to the finance department about a supposedly urgent payment request. And the goal here is to obtain a large sum of money. Then we have phishing. So this is over the phone. So it is particularly effective in combination with other forms of social engineering. So for example, here they could pretend to be someone working at the help desk and then say that they are going to send an email with an attachment to download afterwards. We also have smishing. So this is exactly the same as phishing, except that SMS messages are used instead of emails. And attackers can also drop USB sticks or use email attachments and entice the victims to open them. So out of curiosity, most people will insert the USB key to try and find out who it belongs to, thinking that it might have been lost. An adversary can also carry out physical attacks. So tailgating, for example, that is following a person and holding the door behind them, or the person is then also often polite and will just let you in. And it can also be very interesting for attackers to go through bins. That is called dumpster diving. So especially paper bins next to printers, there you can find pages with printing errors, or those pages can contain possibly sensitive information. So here you can see some examples of phishing. So the aim is to trick people into clicking on the link in order to obtain the access data, have them download malware or get paid. So to recognize these phishing emails and text messages are a few typical characteristics to look out for. So here, for example, they use capital letters and they tell you that it's very important, so that builds up pressure. And here, this SMS, so in this case, it's called phishing. So it looks quite okay, but there is something very wrong with the URL. And for the last example, so here for Swisscom, here we have general greetings. So that's to a customer, and this is not addressed personally. The amount of money here, so exact to the cent, is also suspicious. And there are also some spelling mistakes. Some umlauts here are missing. So here in this other example, it's typically not a language you would expect. So here we have Spanish instead of German or English. We also find the same characteristics as in the previous example. So general greetings, meaning pressure with capital letters, it's written in red, etc. And the goal here is actually to get the victim to open the attachment. So here we have a file with an extension .da, and this is a bit suspicious. So actually it's like a zip file, so it's an archive file. So in this particular case here, it contains malware. So there are several points to bear in mind when receiving such emails. So first of all, why are you expecting this email? Do you know the sender? It is normal to receive such an email from this sender. Is the story in the email plausible? If not, caution here is advised. There are further questions that you can ask yourself. For example, is the email particularly urgent, or is it trying to scare you? Is the sender an authority figure, for example, a supervisor, government agency, etc.? Does the email contain a request to open a document or website or reveal information about your company? And does the email contain an attachment? And if yes, then here again, caution is advised. So in general, if you don't have a good gut feeling about it or something seems a bit odd, please don't hesitate to ask for a second opinion. And you can also contact the sender via another channel, for example, over the phone, to make sure that everything is normal. So no one will blame you for double checking. And to protect against phishing, so the most important thing is to raise awareness among employees, since they are the ones who are targeted and who end up clicking on links and opening attachments. But users are also the last barrier against phishing emails, as they received it. It means that it has reached the target and has not been blocked by the technical protection measures. So technical protective measures only have a limited effect. You are the key for successful detection. However, it is important to use several layers of protections, that is defense in depth. So this concept actually applies to everything, so to the other entry vectors as well. So among the technical measures here against phishing, it is recommended to harden your email infrastructure, so make sure all the system and software are hardened and up to date. You can also use block list or file extensions at the mail gateway or at the firewall. You can perform malware scans of the attachments at the mail gateway, and then the antivirus solution can then automatically quarantine the suspicious files. It's also advisable to disable macros, so now it should be by default, but they are still often misused by attackers to download malware. You can also use anti-spoofing and email authentication mechanisms to filter messages based on validity checks of the standard domain and integrity of the messages. So there you can enable this mechanism within your organization through policies to enable recipients to perform similar message filtering and validation. So please configure your anti-spoofing DNS records. And another advice that we give is to tag external emails. For example, you can add extern to the subject line, and this will help your users, for example, recognize CEO frauds if they would receive a mail in the name of the CEO, but coming from an external email address. So if you are interested in finding out more about how to recognize phishing emails and determine whether the attachment is malicious or not, I would suggest watching my webinar on this topic or reading this blog post. So let's move on to the next technique, that is getting valid credentials. So adversaries may obtain and abuse credentials of existing accounts as a means of gaining initial access. So compromised credentials may be used to bypass access controls placed on various resources and systems within the network, and may be even used for persistent access to remote systems and externally available services such as VPNs, Outlook web access, and remote desktop. So compromised credentials may also grant an adversary increased privilege to specific systems or access to restricted areas of the network. And the adversary may choose not to use malware or tools in conjunction with the legitimate access to those credentials provide, so that it makes it harder for us to detect the presence. These credentials can be obtained in several ways. So they can either be already known, so they are default passwords, or they have been leaked, or they can also be cracked. So now if you are concerned by a data breach, the answer is probably yes, most certainly. You can just have a look at some headlines. So now that the attackers have found your password, and before you have to rename your dog, we will look at how attackers actually crack passwords, and then how you can create a secure password. So these attacks, they rely on users having weak or guessable credentials to crack them, of course. So there are multiple techniques. I'm not going to describe them all here. But for example, in a brute force password attack, a hacker tries to access a user account through trial and error. So this typically involves systematically entering every possible combination of letters, numbers, and symbols into a password field until one works. Also have mask attacks. So it is a type of brute forcing where attackers know elements of a password constructions, and they can therefore reduce the amount of guesses they'll need to get it right. So for example, an attacker might know a password is 8 characters and the last one is a number. Then we also have the dictionary attacks. So here They occur with systematically enters common words and word variations from a specific pre-selected list. It can be, for example, the German dictionary or the names of Swiss mountains, etc. We also have the combinator attacks. So here we have words from two word lists that are combined with one another. That is, the words from the second dictionary are appended to the words from the first dictionary. And the last one here is PRINCE. So it stands for probability infinite chain elements. So this PRINCE attack uses an algorithm to try the most likely password candidates with a refined combinator attack. So it creates chains of combined words by using a single dictionary. So there are, of course, tools and scripts that can be used to automate such attacks, for example, Hashcat. Now, depending on the complexity of the password, that is whether it contains only letters, numbers, or a combination of the two, or if there are also symbols, and above all, depending on its length, the time needed to crack it ranges from less than a millisecond to billions of years. So the more important thing to remember here is that it's not necessarily the complexity that counts, but the length. So now, how can you protect your passwords? So first of all, you should start by choosing a strong password, something like this one. But you should make sure that you can remember it. So to do this, you can use random words that you can combine, or you can use a password like this one here. So the horse doesn't eat cucumber salad. You can also use a mnemonic where you take the first letter of each word in the sentence. So the aim here, the goal is to avoid what is described in the comics, that is simply adding a character at the end of whatever. So what we recommend here is to enforce password policy. So we highly recommend using password managers to generate and store the credentials so that you don't need to remember them all. Then you just need to remember the master password of the password manager. Another important recommendation is to change your default passwords and also to never reuse your passwords. So always use different passwords for all your accounts, especially between business and private ones, because if you do reuse a password, once an account is compromised, so are all the others. So admin users should also have a separate account to respect the least privilege principle. And of course, both accounts should have a different password. What you can also do is to perform regular audits to check the accounts and permission levels routinely and perform periodic password dumping and cracking against your own Active Directory as well, for example. And then if you can crack some password, then you should change them. And last but not least, use two-factor authentication everywhere when possible. So we strongly recommend using an application that requires you to enter a number. Some even indicate your location, like this one here. So this is the Microsoft Authenticator Hub. That way you can do more than just approve a simple SMS or push notification where you don't have any context. So this ensures that it is really you who is trying to log in. Of course, 2FA with physical tokens, such as FIDO keys, are also highly recommended. So to check and monitor credentials for the possible disclosure and a data breach, you can use the online services of Have I Been Pwned? And if they do appear there and you haven't changed your password since, it's more than time to do so. Okay, so now we'll move on to the next technique, which is exploiting open ports in exposed services and systems. So adversaries, they may leverage external facing remote services to initially access and or persist within a network that is provided redundant access mechanism during an attack. So remote services such as VPNs allow users to connect to internal enterprise network resources from external locations. And access to valid accounts to user service is often a requirement for this, so it can be obtained through phishing, as we thought before. So for example, an attacker can gain access to your network by using stolen VPN credentials of one of your suppliers or collaborators. And access may also be gained through an exposed service that doesn't require authentication. And an adversary may also attempt to take advantage of a weakness, that is a vulnerability, in an internet-facing computer or program to gain access. So for that, the attackers, they often use scanning tools or vulnerability scanners to identify these open ports and misconfigured services that are exposed on the internet. So an example of such a scanner is Shodan. So it is a search engine. It searches the internet for publicly accessible devices that have at least one open port. So it thus allows users and attackers to find specific types of computers and services connected to the internet through a series of filters. So here you can search directly for IP addresses, or you can filter by country, by port, by protocol, by vulnerability, etc. So here you can see the example that appears on Shodan's homepage. So here we see the system with this IP address has a lot of open ports. And we also see on the right left-hand side, there are two vulnerabilities from 2018 that are listed. So an attacker could therefore easily leverage this system as an entry point in your infrastructure. So a similar online service to Shodan is Census. So it works actually just the same. So you can also directly search for an IP address, a protocol, a value, etc. So a good idea is to compare the results of the both sites, so you can consolidate them and then assess the reliability of the results. So such scans, especially on publicly accessible servers, they are carried out repeatedly and you can't really avoid them. It is really difficult to prevent this totally. However, there are still measures you can put in place. So you can slow down the scans by rate limiting or blocking the IP addresses as soon as a scan is detected. You can use a web application firewall to block the potentially malicious HTTP requests that are used to detect web vulnerabilities. You can also limit access to remote services through centrally managed systems such as VPNs. And attackers that look for targets with a large attack surface and they don't choose a company specifically. So you should start by knowing your own attack surface, reducing it and securing it accordingly. So you can disable unnecessary services. You should not expose critical services and systems to the internet. So that way you limit your exposure. You can use multi-factor authentication for remote service accounts, such as VPNs, to mitigate an adversary's ability to leverage stolen credentials. You can also segment your network so that you can deny direct remote access to internal systems. And what you can also do, of course, is leverage those online services such as Shodan Assesses or perform vulnerability scans yourself. That way you will discover your own attack surface and ensure that the vulnerabilities that are found can be fixed quickly. Okay, so now let's move on to the next entry vector, that are software vulnerabilities. So unpatched software may allow an attacker to exploit publicly known vulnerabilities to gain access to sensitive information or take control of a system directly. So this one is one of the most commonly found poor security practices and one of the most exploited entry vectors. So the next vulnerability that can't be patched immediately is unfortunately just around the corner. So last year, we've seen multiple vulnerabilities in Microsoft Exchange Server, VPN gateways, border gateways, firewalls, Citrix, Microsoft Outlook, etc. Most of them were at first zero-day vulnerabilities, that is, no patch was available. So this is, of course, a good opportunity for the attackers to gain access to your network and systems. And all these known exploited vulnerabilities are listed in these gaps known exploited vulnerabilities catalog of the CSIRT. So here, this is really why it's extremely important to know your attack surface once again. So what is directly reachable from the internet? And these systems, if they are exposed, they will be sooner or later concerned by such easy to exploit vulnerabilities. So you should know how to react and what to do, because this will happen. This is reality. One of your systems will be or is already concerned. So you should thus prepare for such attacks. So make sure you have documents or playbooks ready for it. Really, you have to prepare for everything that's very likely to come your way. So obviously you can't be prepared for everything, but it's very important that you at least prepare for the most likely scenarios. Yeah. So rather than attacking the ultimate end target directly, a strategy can also revolve around infiltrating third parties, like suppliers and vendors associated with the company, thereby enhancing the likelihood of identifying potential vulnerabilities and eventually abusing their trust relationships to compromise the end target. So that's a so-called supply chain attack. We saw this already in 2020 with the compromise of SolarWinds Orion IT monitoring and management software. That was one of the largest supply chains attacks until now. And last year, we have seen a software supply chain attack on the popular desktop software 3CX. And we also have seen the MOVEit vulnerability incident. So what you can think is that you're not responsible for this. So for patching your systems, that's the job of your IT or your device manufacturer. But that's not completely true. As far as private devices are concerned, that depends on you. Because the reality nowadays is that your own devices are sometimes on the same network as the device is provided to you. So by your company, you probably use services on your work device for personal purposes, and you probably use company services on your personal device. So your personal devices and network can be a gateway or a target. So you should protect them. So make sure that you install antivirus software on all your computers, on cell phones and the tablets excluded, but on Windows you can enable Microsoft Defender, for example. And you can also enable automatic updates. There you can check regularly and force an update if it is necessary. And updates, this applies of course to all mobile devices, computers, smart devices, for example, your TV, network gear, etc. So to help with fixing vulnerabilities, you can introduce a patch and vulnerability management. So vulnerability management is a process of identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and if necessary, fixing vulnerabilities. So establishing a vulnerability management is highly recommended. So its core task is to regularly check systems for vulnerabilities and recognize and fix them before they can be exploited. And this can be done manually or automatically with tools like scanners. And it is important to obtain information on current vulnerability reports via suitable channels and incorporate this into IT management. And this patch management then ensures that the recognized vulnerabilities are closed in a targeted manner by distributing updates and patches. So for more details on setting up vulnerability management, I would refer to the webinar held by Tobias Ellenberger a few months ago. It was recorded and can be found on our YouTube channel. And you can also have a look at our website. There is a blog post on this topic as well. Now, if you can't patch, you should mitigate. But if it's not possible, you should at least monitor. So if there are things that you can't patch, like if a patch doesn't exist yet, as it's the case with derivative vulnerabilities, and if there is no workaround yet, you can at least have a solution in place to scan, protect, monitor, and log, like have an antivirus or an EDR solution. And this protection or monitoring solution should be rolled out everywhere, so every system should be monitored. It should provide centralized administration, and each installation should be updated fully automatically and regularly. Then this solution should also allow to stop or block suspicious activities. And you can also, in best cases, receive alerts in real time. So you can configure this by email, for example, so that the responsible rows are informed, and then you can process actively these alerts. And then each alert can also promptly be checked for its risk potential and prioritized accordingly for follow-up. We also recommend to do regular checks, so make sure that all installations are active and that all systems have the latest signatures. So here it's important to trust but verify. So make sure everything is correctly implemented. Now, regarding logging, you should ensure that all required logs are activated for Windows systems, but also at the perimeter, for example, your VPN, your proxy, etc. And these created logs, they can be centrally collected, monitored, and analyzed. For that, you can use a SEM character. And the logs can also be extended, so you can increase the size, but you can also enable events that are by default deactivated that could be useful. For example, the script block logging in Windows that will record the content of all PowerShell script blocks. Or you can also use other tools like Sysmon from the Sys internal suite from Microsoft. The one is also very important here is segmenting your network. So you should know your critical systems, so your crown jewels, and separate them from the rest of your network. And this also applies, of course, for your backups. They should be isolated in separated zones from the exposed areas. If every one of the systems directly exposed to the internet is vulnerable and is successfully exploited, the segmentation adds an extra obstacle for attackers so that they cannot directly compromise the entire network. So network segmentations helps protect against payload delivery and especially then against lateral movement. Okay, so now, last but not least, this technique was not part of CSIRT advisory, but it is still worth mentioning. It is the use of removable media. So adversaries they may move onto systems, possibly those on disconnected or air-gapped networks, by copying malware to removable media and taking advantage of auto-run or autoplay features when the media is inserted into a system and executes. So auto-run, this is a feature that allows Windows to automatically run the startup program when a CD or DVD or USB device is inserted into a drive. And autoplay, it will issue a notification when an external disk is inserted and offers a menu of choices when the user clicks on this notification. So for those who remember the Stuxnet malware back in 2010 that targeted nuclear plants in Iran, this is what happened then. So the malware was introduced to the target environment via an affected USB flash drive, thus crossing any air-gapped systems. So removable storage media, it requires physical interaction with the system or with a victim. So for example, as we saw at the beginning of the webinar, the attacker could drop a USB stick at the front office of your company. So remember, attackers can also combine techniques. So this would be a typical social engineering move. And if one of your employees would discover this USB stick, he may plug it into his laptop to see what it contains and to whom it might belong, and then get his computer infected. So the attackers here would rely on curiosity, for example, to achieve their goal. So there are also USB sticks that are known as rubber ducky. Those will actually inject payloads via keystroke injection as soon as it gets plugged in your laptop, and the stick will actually present itself as a HID, so human interface device that is just like a normal keyboard. There are also USB charging cables that can be exploited to infect computers with malware. So here, the mobile devices may also be used to infect your computers if they are then connected via USB. So here you can use devices like Android, iOS, etc., and in some instances, USB charging cables. So when a smartphone then connected to a system, it may appear to be mounted similar to a USB connected disk drive, but if malware that is compatible with the connected system is on the mobile device, the malware could infect the machine, especially if auto-run features are enabled. So the use of removable media should and can be prevented via group policies. So for example, you can use application control using AppLocker since Windows 7 and Windows Defender application control since Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016 to block, unsigned, or untrusted executable files from running from USB removable drives. And you can also disable autoplay or auto-run via the registry. But here again, it won't work against rubber ducky, for example, as it is presented as an HID and not as a USB device. So one of the best protective measures would be to promote awareness among employees, so they should be trained not to plug external media, such as USB sticks or unknown cables directly into their computers. Okay. So now we have covered all 5 entry vectors, and we have reached the end of this webinar. It has given you an overview of the most common initial vectors and some measures to prevent them. So if you'd like to go a step further and get more information on how to prepare for and manage an incident, I recommend to read this blog post or watch this webinar on the 316-degree checklist. Just as a reminder, again, together against cyber attacks, so cybersecurity is not just an IT issue. We've seen that through this webinar, everyone can and has to contribute to cybersecurity, because only if everyone works together and helps, then the company can be optimally protected against cyber attacks. So I would like to remind you once again that these webinars take place at least once a month. So we hope to see you at our next webinar in 2 weeks. It will be about tabletop exercises. In the meantime, you can visit our website or find us on social media so that you don't miss anything. And then I thank you again for attending, and I wish you a very nice rest of the day. Take care.